On a suffocating August night in 1833, 17 masters across North Carolina's most fertile cotton counties drew their final breath. They died not in war, not in duels, not by accident of fire or fever, but by a hand they had long believed incapable of striking back. Each body was found beneath the same sign, a crude cross carved into the bedroom door, dripping with fresh blood at dawn. For nearly 2 centuries, their descendants denied, distorted, or erased what happened in those weeks. They called them murders, accidents, outbreaks of madness. But in the dark corners of slave quarters, whispered in hymns and remembered in bones, another story survived. A prophecy, a judgment, a plague of vengeance disguised as the voice of God. And you were never meant to hear it. The authorities buried it so deeply that not a single textbook mentions it. Not one archive admits its pattern. The revolt was methodical, surgical, almost biblical in design. And at its heart stood a man who should not have existed, a gaunt preacher with grey eyes and a voice like thunder, who carried within him 20 years of rage, sharpened into scripture. They knew him as Reverend Josiah Cumberland, but he was no reverend. He was a revenant, a ghost returned from the auction blocks to collect his debt. Before we sink further into this shadow, I need to know something. Where are you watching this from? Tell me in the comments right now. North, south, east, west. It matters, because geography shapes memory. The soil beneath your feet remembers blood you were never told about. And tonight, you'll hear what the soil whispers. Now listen carefully, because from this moment, you are not just a spectator. You are stepping inside a story that has been hidden for 190 years. A story that shifts something in a man once he hears it, and once you know, there is no going back. The why. Year was 1833. Cotton was king, and North Carolina was drunk on prosperity. The rolling hills of Chatham County hid over 4,000 enslaved souls, bent beneath the weight of empire. White-columned mansions rose like monuments to cruelty, their wealth written in lashes and broken backs. Judge William Peton sat as lord of this world, a man whose faith was as hard as his whip, ruling his plantation and courthouse with a Presbyterian certainty that slavery was God's natural order. Colonel Benjamin Crenshaw, a veteran of the War of 1812, ran his estate with military precision, his wife presenting herself as pious and charitable, though her charity never questioned the chains her family profited from. And then there were the Fairchilds, who did not merely own slaves but bred them, reducing men and women to livestock in order to multiply their fortune. These were the masters. These were the names carved in whispers onto the walls of cabins at night. These were the ones marked for judgment. And into this world, like a shadow walking in daylight, came Reverend Josiah Cumberland. Tall, skeletal, eyes that pierced like steel. He arrived with papers from Virginia churches, a Bible worn with years of use, and a voice that could shake rafters. The masters saw only a man of God, a tool for control, someone who could preach obedience to the enslaved, make them docile, make them believe that their chains were holy. They saw a servant of order, but they had invited in something else entirely. Because Cumberland carried scars invisible to them. His family had been torn apart on Richmond's auction blocks. He had been whipped, sold, and broken, but not destroyed. He escaped. And for 20 years he carried one thought in the marrow of his bones, that the day would come when the blood of masters would water the earth they had stolen. He came not as Moses, pleading for release. He came as the plague itself. The first vigil took place at Cedar Grove Plantation, permitted by Mistress Crenshaw, who believed prayer would tame the souls she owned. But the prayer that night was not hers. In the cramped quarters, Cumberland opened his Bible, his voice low, dangerous. "We are not slaves tonight. We are God's chosen, and Pharaoh will not let us go, so we will become the plague." A silence fell over the room. For the first time in their lives, the enslaved heard a gospel not of submission but of blood, not salvation in heaven but vengeance on earth. And from that moment, a clock began to tick toward the blood-soaked August of 1833. Picture the dim glow of a single tallow candle, its smoke curling against the low rafters of a slave cabin. Dozens of faces crowd together in silence, their shadows stretching across the mud walls. The air smells of sweat, wood smoke, and damp earth. And in the center stands Josiah Cumberland, a Bible in one hand, a knife in the other. He does not speak the language of comfort that white preachers use to pacify the enslaved. He does not read Paul's command that slaves obey your masters. Instead, he opens Exodus and whispers, "The Lord said unto Moses, 'Let my people go,' and when Pharaoh refused, the plagues came." His grey eyes roam the crowd. Then he raises the knife and carves a rough cross into a block of wood, his hand steady as if guided by something ancient. "This," he says, holding it up to the candlelight, "is our sign. Not the lamb's blood that spared Israel, but the blood of oppressors that will mark their judgment. When you see this carved upon a door, you will know the angel of death has passed through." A shiver runs through the room. To most of the enslaved, religion had always been weaponized against them. The master's chapels preached obedience as salvation, taught that heaven awaited only after a lifetime of servitude. But Cumberland's gospel is different. It is violent, it is immediate, it is terrifying, and it tastes like freedom. Marcus, a literate house slave at Cedar Grove, listens from the corner. At 32, he has survived 2 decades of bondage by keeping his thoughts hidden. But this preacher unsettles him. Cumberland's voice is fire, and the others lean toward it like starving men toward bread. Marcus feels it too. That hunger, that possibility. Yet beneath it he senses danger, a darkness deeper than even slavery's cruelty. Cumberland is careful. He does not speak of rebellion directly. He cloaks it in scripture, in parable, in imagery that the overseers would never recognize if they overheard. He preaches of Jael driving a tent peg through Sisera's skull, of Judith severing Holofernes' head, of David striking down Goliath. Each sermon drips with examples of the weak rising against the strong by God's hand. The message is unmistakable to the enslaved. You are not victims, you are chosen executioners of divine wrath. And the masters, blind, arrogant, believe he is making their slaves more obedient. Mistress Crenshaw gushes about the godly discipline he is instilling. Judge Peaton allows him to preach at Peaton Hall, boasting that religion is the best whip of all. Colonel Crenshaw grants him access to fields and cabins, convinced his prayers will quiet unrest. They do not realize they are feeding him intelligence. Each visit is reconnaissance. Cumberland memorizes layouts, counts rifles, notes the most brutal overseers and the cruelest families. He recruits in whispers. He teaches not just scripture but strategy, how a scythe becomes a sword, how a rope becomes a noose, how timing becomes salvation. By the second week, he has disciples. Slaves who once muttered hymns with broken voices now carry themselves with dangerous silence. They glance at each other with sparks in their eyes. They move with purpose. They are being transformed, not into obedient Christians, but into soldiers of prophecy. Marcus watches the shift with dread. He cannot deny the power of it. He cannot deny that men who have been crushed for decades now walk as if their chains weigh less. But he feels the storm gathering, and storms always destroy more than they liberate. The masters do not see it. They invite Cumberland to more plantations, believing his presence is a blessing. In truth, they are opening their gates to the architect of their own destruction. Each sermon is another nail in their coffins. Each prayer meeting is another step toward the blood-marked doors. August draws closer. The heat presses down. The air is thick with whispers. And in the candlelit cabins of Chatham County, men and women begin to believe that they are not waiting for Moses. They are becoming the plague. By midsummer of 1833, Cumberland had become more than a preacher. He was an operator, a strategist disguised as a man of God, moving silently through Chatham County's veins, planting seeds that would grow into a harvest of blood. Mistress Eleanor Crenshaw, blinded by piety and pride, expanded his reach herself. She arranged for him to minister at plantations across the county, boasting that her pet preacher was stirring spiritual revival among the slaves. To her mind, religion softened the sharp edges of discontent. To Cumberland, It was perfect camouflage. Each service was reconnaissance, each gathering a recruitment drive, each hymn a rehearsal for judgment. The circuit grew quickly. Within 4 weeks, Cumberland preached at 17 plantations, the same 17 that would later bear crosses in blood. At each stop he studied the terrain, which doors opened without locks, where overseers kept their rifles, how the masters slept, where the dogs were chained, how quickly news could travel between cabins and fields. He counted horses, measured distances, calculated timing. He moved through the land as if reading a map only he could see. But more dangerous than his memory was his invention of a language hidden in plain sight. He knew that open talk of rebellion meant death, so he wrapped instructions in psalms, hymns, and scripture. A spiritual sung in a particular rhythm meant weapons had been secured. A verse from Isaiah dropped in a sermon meant the time is near. A certain passage from Revelation about watchmen on the walls meant eyes must stay fixed on the overseers. Even the crude crosses he carved took on layered meaning to the white masters. They were signs of devotion, pious carvings left behind by a zealous preacher. To the enslaved, they were signals. The angle of the cross, the depth of its cut, the place it was left, all conveyed coded information. A deep cut leaning left might mean, gather here. A shallow one leaning right might mean delay. They were building a system of intelligence invisible to anyone who did not live inside the secret. Cumberland selected his disciples with surgical precision. He looked for men and women whose fire had not gone out, those who had lost children on auction blocks, those who had seen husbands whipped to death, those who carried scars that never healed but still stood tall. These became his Ezekiels, his Davids, his avenging angels. He assigned roles cloaked in biblical imagery. Some became watchmen, responsible for observing and reporting the movements of masters and overseers. Others became messengers, slipping between plantations, carrying fragments of scripture that doubled as tactical updates. The most trusted became executioners. Though Cumberland never used that word, he called them instruments of divine justice. To them, it meant their hands would be the ones to carve the crosses, the ones to make the prophecy flesh. The effect was electric. Men and women who had lived as shadows, punished for every flicker of independence, now walked with a quiet defiance. Their work songs carried double meanings. Their prayers in the fields became signals. Every cabin, every church service, every gathering became a training ground disguised as devotion. And still the masters saw nothing. They nodded approvingly when slaves repeated scripture with new intensity, believing it proved their obedience. They praised Cumberland for his fiery sermons, blind to the fact that the fire was not taming their slaves, it was forging them into soldiers. Mark. He noticed field hands glancing toward the big house, not with fear, but with calculation. He saw the change in their eyes, not submission, but purpose. The air in Chatham County grew heavier as August approached. To outsiders, it was just the oppressive southern summer. To those in the secret, it was anticipation, a storm gathering beneath the stillness, and at the center of it all stood Reverend Josiah Cumberland, whispering scripture that was no longer about heaven or eternity, but about earth, blood, and retribution. The masters had invited him in to strengthen their chains. Instead, he was melting those chains down into weapons. And the countdown had begun. Marcus had learned to survive by silence. For decades he had bent his head when overseers passed, swallowed words that rose like bile in his throat, and kept his thoughts locked behind his eyes. Survival meant invisibility. You worked, you obeyed, you endured. And if you were clever, if you hid your mind well enough, you might live long enough to see your children grow, if they weren't sold away. But Cumberland's presence made silence impossible. Each night in the cabins, Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. The men and women he had lived beside for years were changing. Their voices no longer carried the same weary submission. They whispered with intensity, exchanged glances like conspirators, sang hymns in tones that made his blood run cold. They were being pulled into something vast, something dangerous, something that promised liberation but smelled of death. Cumberland had touched their souls with words they had never been allowed to hear. You are not slaves. You are the chosen, and God's judgment will work through your hands. Marcus had watched men beaten into silence stand taller after those sermons. He had seen women who wept quietly over stolen children now sing with voices like thunder. He could not deny the power in it. For the first time, the broken seemed unbreakable. And yet, beneath his awe ran a thread of dread. Marcus had lived long enough to understand the fury of white vengeance. He had seen what happened when even one slave struck back at a master. Entire families whipped, bodies hung from trees as warnings, blood running into the dirt until the ground itself seemed to scream. He knew what a revolt meant, not just punishment for the guilty, but annihilation for the innocent. Cumberland promised freedom, but Marcus saw fire, blood, and ruin. Still, he could not walk away. Something in the preacher's grey eyes held him fast, as though Cumberland saw into the very marrow of him. During sermons, those eyes sought him out. "Faith without works is dead, brother," the preacher said once, his words falling on Marcus like a weight. It felt less like scripture and more like command. Marcus tried to reason with himself. Perhaps it was only talk, only fire in words, nothing more. But then he noticed the sharpening of tools, the secret meetings in the woods, the sudden discipline in men who once shuffled through fields with broken backs. This was not talk, this was preparation. What unsettled him most was Cumberland's certainty. The preacher spoke of the date, August 28th, as if written in heaven. 7 times 7, the number of completion. That night 17 houses will be marked, and judgment will come. His voice carried no doubt, no hesitation, and when Cumberland spoke, doubt in others seemed to vanish as well. Marcus would lie awake in the loft above the kitchen, staring into the dark, replaying the words. Part of him thrilled at the thought of masters finally facing justice. He remembered lashes that tore skin from his back, nights he had prayed for mercy while overseers laughed. He remembered the sight of children ripped from their mothers, sold like cattle, while Judge Peaton called it the natural order. Yes, there was justice in their blood. But another part of him, the part that had kept him alive for 32 years, whispered that nothing born of so much fury could end in freedom. It would end in fire. And in fire, the innocent burned first. The more Marcus watched, the more he felt trapped between two worlds. To resist Cumberland was to risk being branded a coward, a traitor, or worse, a betrayer of his own people. To follow him was to march into an abyss where survival seemed impossible. And still, night after night, Marcus found himself at those gatherings, listening to words that split him in two: hope and horror, faith and fear, vengeance and ruin. He began to realize that the preacher was not simply leading men, he was reshaping them. He was reaching into their wounds, their losses, their humiliations, and forging them into blades. And Marcus knew deep down that blades once drawn do not return quietly to their sheaths. The woods outside Cedar Grove whispered with cicadas that summer night, their song drowned by the rush of a nearby creek. In the clearing, torches spat sparks into the darkness, casting long, jagged shadows across the faces of men and women gathered in a rough circle. The preacher stood among them, tall and spectral, his grey eyes reflecting the flames like molten iron. This was not a sermon. This was initiation. Cumberland unrolled a scrap of rough parchment, its surface marked with lines and crude sketches. A map, primitive but recognizable. Roads, rivers, plantation houses, 17 properties marked with crosses, 17 names whispered in slave quarters for decades as synonyms for cruelty. Peaton, Crenshaw, Fairchild, 14 more. This, Cumberland said, his voice low but carrying, is the land of Pharaoh, and here, my brothers and sisters, is the night of judgment. He pointed to the parchment, tapping each cross in order. 17 houses, 17 nights of wickedness, but on one night only, they will fall as one. August 28th, the night of completion, 7 times 7. On that night, the angel of death does not pass over. He passes through. The listeners held their breath. The preacher's voice dropped lower, intimate, as though binding each soul to him personally. You are not waiting for deliverance. You are the deliverance. God does not send angels with wings. He sends men with hands, with knives, with fire. He lifted the knife from his belt, its blade catching the torchlight. Without hesitation, he pressed it against his palm, drawing a line of blood. Gasps rose from the circle as he dragged his bleeding hand across the parchment, smearing red over the crosses. "This is the sign," he said, his tone both terrifying and tender. "On their doorposts we will carve it, with their blood we will mark it, and the county will wake to find the judgment of God written on their walls." The ritual was as much psychology as prophecy. By staining the map with his own blood, Cumberland made the rebellion sacred. He made hesitation impossible. Every eye in the clearing glowed with the reflection of fire, some with fury, others with faith, most with both. Then came the assignments. He moved around the circle, pointing to men and women in turn, assigning them their biblical roles. Watchmen, to study the patterns of masters, to track their movements and their weapons. Messengers, to carry coded words between plantations. Executioners, chosen for their strength and unbroken spirit, to perform the act itself. To each he gave scripture as a mask, so that if overheard, no overseer would suspect rebellion. Ezekiel, keep watch. Gabriel, carry the word. Michael, smite with the sword. To the masters, these would sound like harmless devotions. To the enslaved, they were orders of war. And through it all, Marcus stood apart, watching. He saw the way Cumberland's words pulled men and women into his orbit like a dark star. He saw how grief and fury became weapons under his direction. He felt the pull himself, the temptation to believe in something greater than survival, to believe that vengeance could equal freedom. But he also saw the other truth, the one the preacher ignored. Blood never stopped with the guilty. Blood always spread. Cumberland raised his hands above the torchlight, his palms still dripping. When morning comes, 17 crosses will be carved in blood, and the masters will know that God's patience is finished. The circle erupted in low, fervent voices, chants half prayer, half oath. The woods drank their words like ancient witnesses. Marcus shivered. He had heard plans of rebellion whispered before, scattered, desperate, doomed. But this was different. This was not chaos. This was order, precision, purpose. It was not a question of if the storm would break, only when. And when it did, Marcus knew there would be no shelter from it. Dr. Edmund Hartwell had spent 20 years tending to the ailments of Chatham County's wealthy families, fevers, broken bones, childbirths gone awry, but he had also, by necessity, treated the enslaved. Consumption, lash wounds, malnutrition, bodies ground down by labor and cruelty. He had grown accustomed to their silence, their averted eyes, their resigned submission. But lately, something had changed. When called to Cedar Grove to set a broken arm, Hartwell noticed the way the field hands carried themselves, not beaten down, but bristling with something unspoken. Their eyes lingered longer, sharper. They whispered among themselves in tones that did not sound like fear, but like conspiracy. At Peaton Hall, he found a woman humming a spiritual he did not recognize. The tune was familiar, but the rhythm was strange, as though coded. When he asked, she smiled in a way that unsettled him and said it was just the preacher's hymn. That preacher, Reverend Josiah Cumberland. Hartwell had first met him weeks earlier, introduced at a Sunday gathering hosted by Judge Peaton. The man had struck him as severe, almost ascetic, tall, sharp features, eyes that never seemed to blink long enough. His sermons were fiery, but Hartwell had heard fiery preachers before. What disturbed him was the effect. The enslaved leaned toward Cumberland as if he carried their souls in his hands. Their faces, usually so blank in the presence of whites, seemed to burn with hidden fire when he spoke. Hartwell had never seen such intensity among them. It was not the docile piety most planters demanded. It was something else, something restless and dangerous. He mentioned it to Judge Peaton afterward, careful with his words. The man preaches with unusual fervor. Peaton laughed, slapping him on the back. That's the point, Doctor. Religion is the best discipline. Cumberland is worth 10 over Burn. Seers, you'll see. This county will be the picture of obedience by harvest. Hartwell forced a polite smile but said nothing. He had seen enough bodies, white and black alike, to know when a fever was building, and what he saw in Cumberland's listeners was a fever of the soul. The signs multiplied. A young boy at the Crenshaw place carried a carved wooden cross, its edges fresh, its meaning unclear. A slave woman at the Fairchild plantation whispered scripture to herself while sharpening a scythe. Men sang hymns with a rhythm that sounded more like marching than worship. Hartwell felt a chill in his gut. He was no fool. He had read accounts of uprisings in the Caribbean and Virginia. He had seen how quickly whispers could turn into fire. But when he voiced his unease to Colonel Crenshaw during a dinner, the colonel laughed so hard wine spilled down his waistcoat. "Doctor, you worry too much. A black with a Bible is like a mule with a bridle. Cumberland has them so fixed on heaven they'll forget earth altogether. Why, I should thank God for that man." Hartwell did not argue, but he noticed the colonel's slaves watching Cumberland's departing figure with eyes that spoke of earth, not heaven. That night, lying awake beside his sleeping wife, Hartwell turned the pieces over in his mind, the strange hymns, the crosses, the fervor, Cumberland's strange burning certainty. It reminded him not of piety, but of plague. And Hartwell knew better than most. Plagues spread fastest when no one believed they were real. The moon hung low over the pines, swollen and yellow, when Cumberland summoned a small group of his most trusted disciples into the woods beyond Fairchild's fields. They came quietly, slipping from cabins after the overseers had retired, each carrying a tool that could be passed as innocent, a knife, a hatchet, a carpenter's chisel. Marcus followed at a distance. He had not been called, but something in him refused to stay behind. He needed to see. They gathered in a hollow where the trees pressed close, muffling sound. Cumberland stood before them, his long coat open, his Bible in one hand, a small wooden bowl in the other. By torchlight, Marcus saw the bowl was filled with something dark and viscous. Blood. Cumberland's voice carried low and steady. In Egypt, the blood marked the doors of God's people. Tonight, the blood marks the doors of Pharaoh, so that when the angel of death comes, he shall not pass over, he shall strike. One by one he called them forward. A young man named Isaiah cut his palm and let it drip into the bowl. A woman named Ruth did the same, her face carved with grief that never softened. She had lost 2 children to the auction block. Others followed. Their blood mingled in the bowl until it was thick, until it was one. Then Cumberland dipped his finger into the mixture and pressed it against the trunk of a pine, carving a crude cross into the bark with his knife. The blood smeared into the cut, dark against pale wood. "This is our sign," he said. His grey eyes glinted in the torchlight, not with frenzy, but with something colder, something that made Marcus shiver. "This is what Pharaoh will see on his doors, on his walls, on his very flesh. The Lord has said, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' and he has chosen his instruments." He turned to the group. "Each of you will carry this sign. Practice now. Mark it, deep and sure." They obeyed. One after another, they stepped forward, carving crosses into the surrounding trees, smearing blood into the cuts until the clearing looked like a grove of executioners' totems. The torches hissed, the cicadas droned, and the night filled with the rhythm of knife on bark, knife on bark, knife on bark. Marcus could barely breathe. This was no longer metaphor, no longer parable wrapped in scripture. This was ritual. This was preparation. When every tree bore its mark, Cumberland raised the bowl. "With this blood we bind ourselves. With this blood we become one body, one hand, one judgment. On the night appointed, these marks will be on their doors. Their houses will not be passed over. Their names will be struck from the earth." He drank from the bowl. The others followed, grim and trembling, until the last drops were gone. Marcus stumbled back into the dark, his heart pounding. He wanted to run, to shout, to shake them free from the spell, but part of him knew it was already too late. The ritual had bound them together, not just in faith, but in blood. And in that moment, Marcus realized something he had dreaded but never admitted. This would happen. Not if, not perhaps, it would happen. The night of blood was no longer a dream or a threat. It was already alive, pulsing in the woods, carved into trees, whispered into the soil itself. The first crosses had been drawn, and soon they would be drawn on doors. Dr. Edmund Hartwell prided himself on being a man of science in a county steeped in superstition. He believed in fevers, not curses, in infection, not omens. But the more he observed Reverend Josiah Cumberland, the more he felt something gathering in the air, not fever, not contagion, but a pressure he could not name. He told himself it was imagination, yet imagination became harder to dismiss after what he found in the woods. It was a sultry evening, heavy with the smell of pine sap and damp earth. Hartwell had been called to the Fairchild plantation to tend to a child with scarlet fever. After dosing the boy with calomel and instructing the mother to keep him cool, Hartwell lingered outside for air. He took the long path home through the woods, his satchel swinging at his side, his boots sinking into soft earth. That was when he saw it. At first it was only a glimmer in the torchlight he carried, a scar in the bark of a pine. He stepped closer, raising the light. The cut was deliberate. A cross, freshly carved, the grooves filled with something dark that had dried unevenly. His physician's eye recognized it instantly. Blood. Hartwell's stomach tightened. He ran his fingers lightly over the grooves, the tackiness still faintly clinging to the wood. He lifted them to his nose. Copper, unmistakable. A cross in blood, carved where no overseer or planter would ever see it. He stood in the silence of the pines, listening. Cicadas droned, a whippoorwill called, but beneath it he felt a pulse of dread. This was no child's prank. This was ritual. This was message. He looked around and saw more of them. Faint at first, then obvious. Another tree marked, and another. A ring of crosses carved deep, darkened with blood, circling the clearing like sentinels. Hartwell's torchlight quivered. His medical mind sought rational explanation, a secret religious devotion, harmless ritual of the enslaved. But his gut whispered otherwise. He had read the newspapers, the accounts from Virginia and Haiti. He remembered Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, how the Richmond papers printed stories of crosses and visions and blood-soaked prophecy. He heard Cumberland's voice in his memory, the fire of those sermons, the way the slaves leaned toward him, their eyes alight, the strange hymns, the carved tokens, the fervor that had no place in the docility planters demanded. And now this, crosses, not of chalk or paint, but of blood. Hartwell stood very still in that clearing, his torch hissing in the night air. He understood then that he was looking at the outline of something vast and dangerous, something that moved in shadows while the county slept in arrogance. A rebellion. The thought struck him cold, though he did not speak it aloud, even in the empty woods. His mind raced through the families he knew, Crenshaw, Peaton, Fairchild, men fattened on cruelty, women blind with entitlement, children raised in arrogance. He pictured them in their beds while, across the county, their slaves carved crosses in blood. The physician's hands trembled. He knew what came of rebellions. He had seen the reprisals, bodies hung from trees, whole families of slaves executed for one man's defiance. If Cumberland was truly orchestrating such a thing, it would not end in freedom. It would end in fire and mass death. He thought of warning Colonel Crenshaw, of speaking plainly, but he could already hear the laughter, the dismissal, the accusations of paranoia. The planters did not believe in uprisings, not here, not in their county. They believed in the whip, the rifle, the chains. To them, those were stronger than any sermon. Hartwell looked once more at the blood-stained crosses, each one a silent oath, and extinguished his torch. The night swallowed him. As he walked back to town, one thought echoed in his mind, louder than cicadas, louder than whippoorwills. This is not fever, this is plague, and it is already spreading. Marcus had seen men practice obedience all his life. He had watched slaves rehearse how to bow, how to avert their eyes, how to step aside when a master passed. He had seen bodies trained into silence and spirits bent into stillness, but never had he seen practice like this. It began subtly, hidden beneath the guise of evening prayer. A few men, chosen carefully by Cumberland, lingered after the hymns. They would remain when the others shuffled back to their quarters, when the air grew cool and the candles guttered low. At first, Marcus thought they were engaged in deeper scripture, secret lessons meant only for the boldest souls, but soon he realized that the Bible was only a veil. Cumberland would call them into the woods, where the cicadas screamed and the moon hung low. There he spoke not of heaven, but of timing, not of salvation, but of method. He placed tools in their hands, not swords, for they had none, but axes, hoes, scythes. He showed them where to grip, how to swing. He spoke of leverage, of silence, of precision. His voice was calm, steady, as if he were still reading from the Holy Book. Marcus stood at the edge of the gathering, his breath shallow. He told himself he was only observing, not participating. But even an observer is changed by what he sees. He watched as men who had spent their lives breaking their backs for others now lifted their tools with a different purpose. They struck stumps as if splitting skulls. They moved in pairs, learning to coordinate, to strike swiftly and together. They practiced dragging burlap sacks through the dirt as if dragging bodies. The preacher's words were slow and deliberate. Faith without works is dead. Justice without action is nothing but wind. When the night comes, you must be more than believers. You must be instruments. His grey eyes cut across the clearing, fixing on each man, each woman. The Forelli might carved his gaunt face into something that looked less like flesh than iron. He was no longer only a preacher. He was commander, prophet, executioner. Marcus felt his stomach twist. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. There was something hypnotic in the scene, the rhythm of the blows, the whispers of scripture bent into war cries, the way the preacher's words fused vengeance with divine inevitability. He saw faces around him alight with a kind of fire he had never known, not joy, not madness, but resolve. And yet beneath that resolve, Marcus saw something more dangerous. Hope. For years, hope had been the most forbidden possession. Hope was the thing masters crushed, the thing overseers beat out of men until their eyes dulled. But here, in the dark woods, hope was alive again. Hope that the lash could be answered, that chains could break, that the oppressor's beds were not untouchable sanctuaries. Cumberland stoked that fire carefully. He reminded them of their children sold, their wives violated, their fathers whipped until their backs were pulp. He told them that God had marked their enemies for judgment and that their hands would deliver it. Every memory of pain became tinder. Every scar became a blade. But as the rehearsals grew more elaborate, Marcus's unease deepened. He saw how quickly men became soldiers, how fast prayers became strategies. He saw women sharpen blades meant for harvest and smile faintly as they tested the edges. He saw boys no older than 15 carry messages between clearings, their eyes shining with secrecy and pride. It was no longer theory. It was readiness. Marcus lay awake at night in the quarters, listening to the whispers that passed from bunk to bunk. He felt the tremor in the air, anticipation, as if the whole county itself was inhaling before the plunge. He thought of the blood-marked crosses Dr. Hartwell might have already seen. He thought of the date Cumberland had promised, August 28th. The preacher had given them the image. Now he was giving them the muscle memory, and Marcus, caught in the tide, began to realize something dreadful. Whether he joined them or not, whether he struck or stood aside, he would be marked by what was coming. When blood began to flow, there would be no neutrality, no safety in silence. The rebellion was no longer in the making. It was already alive. Judge William Peaton believed in two things above all else, God's law and man's law. To him they were one and the same, braided together in chains that bound society into its rightful hierarchy. He rose each morning in his grand house, surveyed his cotton fields from the veranda, and saw order stretching out before him, men bent at the waist, women moving in measured rhythm, overseers barking commands. It was a vision that confirmed everything he preached from the courthouse bench. But order has cracks, and cracks begin quietly. The first came in whispers. Peaton heard from his overseer that some of the field hands were singing differently in the evenings. The melodies were familiar, but the words lingered oddly, as if they carried meaning beyond their surface. The overseer dismissed it as nonsense, but Peton made note. Then came the matter of the tools. Hoes missing, hatchets misplaced, a pruning knife vanished from the barn. The overseer explained it away as carelessness, theft for barter. Peton accepted the excuse, but unease gnawed at him. Then came the glances. Peton had spent decades around slaves. He prided himself on reading them. Averted eyes, submissive posture, murmured replies, all predictable. Yet lately he had noticed something different. A few of the younger men no longer dropped their gaze quickly enough. Their eyes lingered a moment too long, not with open defiance, but with something quieter, more dangerous. A thought they were not supposed to have. At supper one evening, his wife remarked on how restless the servants seemed. "Perhaps they are uneasy from Reverend Cumberland's preaching," she suggested lightly, spooning collards onto her plate. "He stirs them too much. Sometimes I wonder if it is wise." Peton scowled, but not at her. "Nonsense, the man brings them scripture. Scripture makes them obedient. There is no harm in reminding them of their place in God's design." Yet even as he said it, unease prickled in him. The unease grew sharper days later, when a slave boy was caught carving something into the doorframe of a shed. The overseer dragged him to Peton, clutching the boy's arm so tightly the child whimpered. There, etched shallowly into the wood, was a crooked cross. The boy stammered that it was only a mark, a decoration. The overseer raised his whip to beat him senseless, but Peton stayed the blow. He stared at the cross, at the boy's frightened eyes. Something about it troubled him, though he couldn't say why. He ordered the boy flogged lightly and sent back to the quarters. But that night, as he sat in his study, the image lingered. A cross, carved where it had no business being. Peton poured himself brandy and told himself it was nothing. Boys carved foolish things. Preachers filled their heads with half-understood scripture. Still, he made a note to mention it at the next gathering of planters, not because he truly believed danger lurked, but because it was his duty as judge to preserve vigilance. What Peton could not see, what his arrogance blinded him to, was that the signs were everywhere. He walked through his plantation as though through a dream, missing the charged glances exchanged between slaves, the sharpened edges of tools handled too carefully, the whispers that fell silent when he approached. He mistook stillness for peace, when in truth it was the taut stillness before storm. Cumberland himself had visited just days before, holding one of his fiery sermons in the quarters while Peton remained at ease in his study, convinced the preacher was reinforcing obedience. He had not listened closely enough to hear the undercurrent, the venom wrapped in scripture. He had not looked closely enough to see that what seemed like worship was in fact training. In his mind, the world remained in order. The laws of God and man were unshaken. His plantation thrived, his slaves obeyed, his overseers enforced. He saw cracks, yes, whispers, glances, marks, but he told himself they were nothing. And so the judge slept soundly at night in his great house, while outside the air grew heavier with each passing day, the silence sharper, the glances more electric. The storm had already entered his walls. He simply refused to recognize it. Marcus had survived slavery by mastering the art of invisibility. He had learned when to bow his head, when to hold his tongue, when to let rage bury itself deep where no overseer could see. That invisibility had been his shield for 32 years, the thin veil that let him endure while others were broken. But invisibility cannot last forever. It was Cumberland who tore it away. The night was hot and breathless, the air thick as soup. They gathered in the woods, far beyond the reach of overseer eyes, the torchlight bending shadows into monstrous shapes. Cumberland stood before them, his gaunt frame rigid, his eyes burning with something more than faith. Around him, the chosen men and women leaned forward, waiting for his command. Marcus lingered near the back, as he always did, watching, listening, hoping that silence might keep him safe. But Cumberland's gaze found him. "Brother Marcus," the preacher's voice rang out, low but sharp as a blade. "Step forward." The circle shifted. All eyes turned toward him. He felt their heat, their expectation, their hunger. His heart pounded against his ribs. He wanted to refuse, to fade back into the dark, but refusal was not an option. He stepped forward, slow, each stride like walking into fire. Cumberland held out a tool. Not a sword, not a weapon forged in iron, but a pruning knife, its blade glinting orange in the torchlight. "You have listened long enough," the preacher said. "Tonight, you will act." Marcus swallowed hard. His fingers itched to stay at his sides, but he forced himself to take the knife. Its weight was slight, but in that moment it felt like an anvil. Cumberland pointed to a post they had driven into the earth, a rough wooden stake meant for demonstration. "Strike," he commanded. Marcus froze. The circle leaned closer. Whispers buzzed around him, encouragement, challenge, warning. He saw their faces, men who had suffered the lash, women who had lost children, boys who had seen fathers broken. Their eyes were filled with a fire he did not share, but could not deny. Still, he hesitated. Cumberland's voice dropped lower, colder. "Faith without works is dead. Do you believe God will deliver you, Marcus? Or do you believe the chains are eternal?" Marcus lifted the knife. His hand trembled. For an instant he saw not the post, but the pale face of Colonel Crenshaw, the whip in his fist. He saw Judge Peaton's cold eyes from the courthouse bench. He saw masters sleeping sound in their beds while their slaves wept in silence. Rage surged, hot, sharp, sudden. Before he could think, the knife came down. Wood split. The sound cracked the air. Gasps rose around him, followed by murmurs of approval. Cumberland's lips curved into something between a smile and a snarl. "You see," the preacher thundered, "even the cautious ones know the truth. Even the quiet ones carry fire in their blood. Tonight a post. Tomorrow, Pharaoh." The circle erupted in low cries, hands raised, fists clenched. Marcus stood in the middle, breathless, the knife still in his hand. His heart hammered, not from victory but from terror. He had crossed a line. His invisibility was gone. Cumberland clapped a hand on his shoulder, heavy, possessive. "You are chosen now, Marcus. No turning back." The crowd echoed, "No turning back, no turning back." Marcus forced a nod, though dread coiled inside him. He knew the truth. He had not chosen this. He had been claimed by it. And once claimed, there was no escape. Dr. Edmund Hartwell could not sleep. The blood-marked trees haunted him, glowing in his memory like embers that refused to die. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw them. The crosses, the dried crimson, the silent message carved into the living wood. He told himself he was a man of science, but science offered no explanation that could smother the truth. This was not ritual alone. It was warning, and the warning was multiplying. In the week that followed, Hartwell noticed more of the marks. Faint, sometimes freshly carved, sometimes older but still visible. They were appearing near plantations across the county, always in hidden places, the side of a barn, the root of a tree, the frame of an abandoned smokehouse. They seemed to spread like a sickness, a language only a chosen few could read. Hartwell's hands shook each time he touched one. He thought of Nat Turner, of Haiti, of rebellions that had left blood in their wake. He thought of the cost, not only for the masters but for the enslaved. He knew how the planters would react. He had seen it before. The fury, the hangings, the indiscriminate punishment. A single spark could set the whole county ablaze in violence, and yet silence was just as dangerous. He sat at his desk one evening, quill in hand, staring at blank parchment. Should he write to the governor, to the militia? Should he summon the judge and the colonels and tell them what he had seen? He pictured their faces, sneering, dismissive, a physician playing at prophecy. They would laugh at him. Worse, they would accuse him of spreading panic. Still, the image of the crosses pressed on his mind. He thought of his wife Sarah sleeping upstairs. He thought of his children, their rooms filled with books and toys, their innocence unbroken. He imagined torches in the night, screams, the sound of doors splintering. And beneath it all, he thought of Tiden, his slaves themselves. The men and women who came to him for medicine when the overseer's whip split skin, when fever burned through their bones. He had seen their suffering, their quiet endurance, and now he imagined them not as patients but as soldiers, holding blades meant for vengeance. Hartwell's chest tightened. If he warned the planters, the rebellion might be crushed before it began. But at what cost? Innocents would die in retaliation, guilty or not. If he stayed silent, the rebellion might strike with fury, and the blood of masters and their families would cover the land. It was a choice, with no clean hands. At last he pushed the quill aside. He could not yet decide, but he knew one thing with certainty. Time was running out. Each day, the air grew heavier, the nights sharper, the silence more alive. Something was coming, and when it came, neither God's law nor man's law would be enough to stop it. The night smelled of pine and sweat. The woods were thick with shadows, but the fire in the clearing cast long, violent shapes across the faces gathered there. Dozens of them now, men, women, even boys, all leaning forward, all straining for Cumberland's voice. He stood before them with his Bible in one hand and a scythe in the other, the book and the blade. His eyes glowed in the firelight, grey and unyielding. "My children," he said, his voice slow and heavy, each word pressed into the air like a brand. "The time of prophecy is over. The time of fulfillment is at hand." A murmur swept the circle. Marcus felt it in his bones, the trembling anticipation, the breathless hunger. Cumberland raised the scythe. "The angel of death has passed over Pharaoh's house. Now the sword of the Lord shall not pass over yours. On the 28th day of this month the chains break. On that night Egypt shall weep." The crowd answered with low cries, some weeping, some laughing, some pounding the earth with their fists. Marcus remained still, his throat dry. Then came the part that turned his blood cold. Cumberland lowered the scythe and began to speak names. "Brother Elias, you and your men will take the Crenshaw house. Strike swift, strike silent. Brother Josiah, Judge Peaton's estate falls to you. Sister Ruth, you and the women will see to the kitchens. Let no master rise from his bed. Let no mistress call for help." The names fell like hammer blows, each one sealing a fate. Every man, every woman received a task, some to strike overseers, some to gather weapons, some to cut bridges and block roads. The plan was vast, intricate, terrifying in its precision, and then Cumberland's gaze fell upon Marcus. "Brother Marcus," he said, the voice curling like smoke, "you will guide the little ones. When the blood runs, you will lead them to safety, for even in war, the lambs must be preserved." The circle turned toward him, nodding, approving. To them it was an honor, a trust, but Marcus felt the weight of chains heavier than any iron he had ever worn. He could not refuse. He could not protest. Cumberland had placed him in the story, had written him into the scripture of this rebellion. The preacher stepped closer, pressing the Bible into Marcus's hands. "Do not fear," he whispered, though the words carried the sting of command. "The Lord has chosen you for this. You are marked, as surely as the trees are marked with blood." Marcus's hands trembled around the book. He looked at the faces around him, lit by fire, burning with resolve. There was no doubt in them, no hesitation. They had crossed the river already in their hearts. And Marcus understood with a sick twist in his stomach that there was no way back for him now. Whether he struck or not, whether he obeyed or not, he was bound to them. Their fate would be his. The rebellion had a date. It had names. It had targets. And Marcus, unwilling, unready, afraid, was now a part of it. Judge William Peaton prided himself on being the steward of order in Southampton County. For decades he had kept the balance, the law in the courthouse, the lash in the fields, the pulpit in the quarters. It was, to his mind, an equilibrium blessed by God and secured by his own vigilance. But lately, the equilibrium had begun to tilt. The first sign came when one of Colonel Crenshaw's field hands vanished. The overseers searched the woods, dragged the swamps, and scoured the neighboring plantations, but the man was gone without a trace. A runaway, they said. Yet Crenshaw swore the man had never shown the nerve for escape. A simpleton, too attached to his kin to flee. Something didn't sit right. Then came the whispers. Low, nervous, carried by servants into the great houses. Whispers of meetings in the dark, of tools missing, of marks carved where no marks belonged. The kind of whispers that made wives glance at their husbands with fear in their eyes, that made overseers drink harder than usual. And then there were the songs. Piton himself heard them one humid evening while riding past the quarters. The voices rose in unison, carrying the familiar strains of a hymn, yet the rhythm was off, too sharp, too urgent, as if the words masked another meaning. He reined in his horse and listened, his jaw tightening. When the singers noticed him, the song broke apart into silence, too quickly, too deliberately. That was when the first coil of unease wound itself around his heart. At the next planters' meeting held in the Crenshaw parlour, Piton raised his glass and cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, I have reason to believe we are neglecting vigilance." The others scoffed. Colonel Crenshaw, red-faced from brandy, waved a hand. "Always the judge, always sniffing for danger. What do you suppose? That they're plotting against us? A rabble of blacks overthrowing their masters? Absurd." "Absurd?" Piton's voice sharpened. "Did we not see it in Haiti? Have we not heard of Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey? Do not think Southampton is immune. God's order is firm, but the devil stirs the weak-minded." Some nodded, others muttered. None wanted to admit their fear aloud. Fear gave power to rumors, and planters lived on the illusion of control. Still, Piton pressed on. "I have seen the signs. Songs that carry double meanings, symbols carved in wood, servants with eyes too bold. We would be fools to dismiss it. Better to act first than to suffer later." A silence followed. It was broken only by the clink of Colonel Crenshaw setting down his glass. "What do you suggest, Judge?" Piton leaned forward, his hand curling around his cane. "A tightening, stricter watches, no gatherings without white supervision, arms kept close, and should we find evidence of conspiracy, we strike without hesitation. Mercy is weakness." The room murmured. Some balked at the severity. Others found grim comfort in his words. Yet beneath it all, Piton sensed what they feared most, not the slaves themselves, but the possibility that their perfect order was not as secure as they claimed. That night, as Piton returned home, his unease deepened. The air itself felt charged, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. He told himself that vigilance would hold the line, that law and lash would prevail. But in the dark beyond his estate, the rebellion was no longer rumor. It was gathering weight, sharpening its edge, waiting for the 28th. And Piton, for all his warnings, was still blind to how close the blade already hovered above his throat. Marcus had always survived by silence. In 32 years of bondage, he had learned the art of invisibility, eyes lowered when spoken to, thoughts swallowed before they could form words, a face that betrayed nothing. Silence was a shield, and it had carried him through beatings, through separations, through the grinding monotony of endless toil. But now silence felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Each night he lay on the pallet in his cabin, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant thrum of cicadas and the low murmur of voices drifting from other quarters. He knew what they whispered: plans, assignments, the dates, the routes, the blood that would be spilled. It was no longer talk, it was inevitability, and he could not escape the knowledge, because Josiah Cumberland had seen to it that Marcus, reluctant though he was, had been drawn into the inner circle. He remembered the preacher's eyes, sharp, grey, penetrating, fixing on him like nails driven into wood. "Faith without works is dead, brother. You understand this, don't you?" Marcus had nodded, because what else could he do? But inside, terror curdled his stomach. And now, 3 days before the 28th, he was breaking apart. If the plan succeeded, 17 masters would lie in pools of blood. 17 crosses carved in wood and flesh would scream judgment. The enslaved would rejoice, if only for a moment, before the county, no, the entire state, descended upon them with fire and steel. Marcus had seen enough of the white man's fury to know how this would end. Retaliation would not distinguish between conspirator and bystander. Men, women, children, all would be swallowed in the punishment. But if the plan failed, the lash, the rope, the pyre, 1,000 deaths in a single night, and Marcus, by his silence, would be complicit. It was in this state of torment that he found himself drawn toward Dr. Edmund Hartwell. The physician was no friend, no white man could ever be called such, but there was something in his manner, a gentleness, a restraint that separated him from the others. Hartwell listened when slaves spoke. He treated wounds without cruelty. He seemed haunted by something Marcus couldn't name. Could he be trusted? Could he bear the truth? The thought gnawed at Marcus as he carried water, as he tended fires, as he moved through the rituals of bondage. His mind returned again and again to that choice, silence or speech, survival or warning. He imagined approaching Hartwell under the pretense of illness, pulling him aside, whispering the prophecy. He imagined the doctor's eyes widening, his jaw tightening, his hands trembling as he realized the scale of what was coming. He imagined, and this was the terror, Hartwell recoiling, betraying him to Piton, and Marcus swinging from a tree before sundown. But then he imagined another vision, his mother's face, long gone, whispering to him from memory. "Do not let them make you a part of their evil, son. Do not carry another man's blood on your hands." The nights grew longer. The air thickened with dread, and Marcus knew that his silence had become unbearable. He began watching Hartwell closely, seeking an opening, a moment alone, a space where words could be spoken without witnesses. He did not yet know what he would say, nor how he would survive the consequences, but something inside him had shifted. The instinct that had kept him silent for decades was cracking, and in that fracture, a dangerous idea was forming, that perhaps one voice, trembling though it might be, could alter the course of what was about to come. The question that stalked him was simple. Would Hartwell hear him? Or would he seal his own doom the moment he opened his mouth? The answer waited in the shadow. News of the days to come. The chance came on a blistering afternoon when the sun hung like a furnace over the fields and the overseers dozed in the shade of their horses. Marcus had been ordered to fetch water from the well at the edge of Peaton Hall, near where Dr. Hartwell had come to tend to a fevered housemaid. Hartwell moved with the quiet efficiency of a man used to death and suffering, yet unwilling to harden himself completely against it. He pressed a cool cloth to the girl's brow, spoke to her in low tones, and ignored the overseer's impatient tapping of boots on the porch. When Marcus approached with the bucket, their eyes met for the briefest moment. Hartwell nodded, the smallest gesture, but it carried weight. Recognition. Respect, even. Marcus's heart pounded. This was the moment he had been rehearsing in his mind for nights on end. He lowered the bucket to the stones, wiped sweat from his brow, and whispered without looking directly at the doctor. "Sir, there is danger coming." Hartwell paused, his hand still on the girl's forehead. He did not turn his head, but Marcus saw the flicker in his expression, a tightening of the jaw, a sharpness in the eyes. "Speak carefully," Hartwell murmured, so low that only Marcus could hear. Marcus swallowed hard. His mouth was dry, his voice nearly breaking. "The preacher, Cumberland. He is not what he seems. He plans blood. Many will die. You must listen." The words hung in the air like sparks threatening to ignite a blaze. For a moment, Marcus feared he had gone mad, that Hartwell would recoil, call for the overseer, and end his life with a single shout. But Hartwell did not shout. He rose slowly, excusing himself from the sick room, and beckoned Marcus toward the edge of the yard where the shade of a magnolia tree concealed them. Only then did he turn, his face stern but not hostile. "Say it plain," Hartwell demanded. "What do you mean?" Marcus's voice trembled. 17 houses, 17 masters. Before the month is out, their blood will be spilled. Cumberland says it is God's will, but it is not God, it is revenge. He is no preacher. He is one of us, a man who was broken and returned to break others. Hartwell's eyes narrowed. He studied Marcus as though weighing every syllable, testing the truth in his tone. The silence stretched, unbearable, until Hartwell spoke again. "You risk your life telling me this." Marcus almost laughed, a bitter, cracked sound. "My life is already at risk. Whether I speak or stay silent, death will find me, but maybe if you know, it will not find the children, not all of them." The doctor exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples as though fighting against the weight of revelation. "I feared as much," he admitted at last. I have heard his sermons, too much fire, too much blood. But this is more than zealotry. This is war. Yes, Marcus whispered. And it comes in 3 nights. Hartwell's gaze hardened, the quiet gentleness replaced by grim resolve. Then we have little time. You must not speak of this again. Not to anyone. Do you understand? If they suspect you, your blood will be the first spilled. Marcus nodded, though his stomach churned. He had done it, spoken the words that clawed at his chest. Whether Hartwell would act on them, or whether they had only condemned him further, remained unknown. As Marcus walked back toward the quarters, his legs felt weak, his breath shallow. The die had been cast. Silence was no longer his shield. Somewhere deep inside, he knew there was no turning back. Dr. Edmund Hartwell had always prided himself on seeing what others chose not to see. It was a physician's gift, or curse. He saw the bruises left on backs where discipline had gone too far. He saw the hollow eyes of women forced to bear children they did not choose. He saw the brittle bones of children bent under labor meant for men, and though he rarely spoke of it aloud, he carried those images like ghosts wherever he walked. Now, Marcus's words gave those ghosts a voice. Cumberland, not a preacher, but a revenant. A man who had returned not with salvation, but with vengeance in his marrow. The revelation gnawed at Hartwell. He could not ignore it. So, while the planters drank brandy and assured themselves of control, Hartwell began his own investigation. Quietly, carefully. He started with the letters Cumberland carried, the supposed endorsements from Virginia churches. At first glance, they looked authentic. The seal, the handwriting, the biblical phrasing, but Hartwell had handled enough correspondence to sense something amiss. The ink was newer than it should have been, the phrasing oddly stilted, as though the writer had borrowed words but not tone. A forgery, cleverly crafted but imperfect. From there, Hartwell questioned in subtler ways. He asked Cumberland about seminary halls in Richmond, about professors by name, about doctrines debated in the 1820s. The preacher's answers were smooth, practiced, yet too general, no detail, no familiarity. He evaded with scripture, his silver tongue coating over gaps. To most men it would pass unnoticed, but to Hartwell it was confirmation. The final blow came not from documents, but from memory. Years ago, Hartwell had travelled through Richmond on business. He remembered the auction block, the way the air had stank of sweat and fear, the way children screamed as they were torn from mothers. One face lingered, in his memory even now, a tall, gaunt youth with grey eyes that blazed with fury even as tears streaked his cheeks. A boy sold south, his family scattered. When Hartwell looked into Cumberland's eyes under the lantern glow of a plantation chapel, he knew. It was the same fire, older, sharpened, but unmistakable. Cumberland was no minister. He was that boy, grown into a man who had never let go of the wound. The doctor's stomach turned with dread. Marcus had spoken truth. And worse, Cumberland's deception was not the rash fantasy of a desperate soul, but a long-honed plan, decades in the making. That night, Hartwell sat alone in his study, staring at the medical instruments laid neatly on his desk. Tools meant to heal, not harm. Yet he could not shake the thought. Cumberland's tools were sharpened too, not to heal but to cut. Both of them wielded knowledge, but where Hartwell sought to preserve life, Cumberland had consecrated himself to death. The choice before Hartwell was stark. If he exposed Cumberland now, he might save 17 households, but he would also condemn hundreds of enslaved people to slaughter, whether guilty or innocent. If he stayed silent, blood would flow anyway, perhaps more, perhaps less, but with a chance, however slim, of breaking the chains that bound so many. He felt trapped in the same snare Marcus had described, silence or speech, complicity or betrayal. At dawn, Hartwell looked in the mirror and barely recognized his own reflection. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed. He had seen enough of death in his years as a doctor, but this was different. This was death dressed in scripture, death marching with inevitability. And yet, against his better judgment, a strange thought whispered in his mind. Perhaps Cumberland is not entirely wrong. Perhaps judgment is overdue. It was then Hartwell realized he was already being pulled into the current. The rebellion was no longer only Cumberland's, it was becoming everyone's. The night fell heavy, as though the sky itself conspired to smother the land in darkness. Clouds blotted the moon, and the air hung thick, damp, waiting. It was August 28th, the night Josiah Cumberland had marked as prophecy fulfilled. Marcus felt it in his bones before the first cry shattered the silence. He had not joined the others that evening. He lingered near the quarters, his hands trembling, every breath shallow. He thought of Hartwell. He thought of his mother's voice. He thought of the children whose laughter still echoed in daylight, unaware of what midnight would bring. And then, the scream. It came from Cedar Grove, Colonel Crenshaw's house, a sound ripped from a throat at the instant of death. Marcus staggered where he stood, his stomach clenching. Then the bellows of alarm, the frantic barking of dogs, the crack of gunfire, the shrieks of women. The rebellion had begun. He could picture it, even without seeing. Cumberland at the forefront, grey eyes alight with something more than zeal. The chosen disciples, their hands gripping axes, scythes, hammers, tools turned to weapons. The door splintering, Crenshaw rising from his bed, confusion etched on his face, a heartbeat before the blade struck. Blood on the floorboards, a cross carved into the wood above the door, still wet as the body cooled. Marcus sank to his knees, his heart pounding like war drums. Every fibre in him screamed to run. But where? Into the woods, where patrols would hunt? Toward Hartwell, whose own silence was now a question of survival? Or into the chaos, to join what he feared and dreaded? The night gave him no time to choose. From plantation to plantation the fire spread. At Riverside, the Fairchilds died screaming, their fortune in flesh repaid in blood. At Peaton Hall, the judge himself was roused from bed to the sight of shadows slipping through his doors, the smell of smoke thickening as his slaves rose not in song, but in vengeance. The symbols Cumberland had promised appeared everywhere, crude crosses carved fast, dripping crimson. They glared from doorposts, from walls, from bodies, each one a message not just to the living, but to the world itself. Judgment had come. By dawn, 17 households lay in ruin. Masters who had strutted through courtrooms and parlors now sprawled broken across their own polished floors. Their wives clutched children who would never wake. Their estates, once monuments to power, stood hollow and haunted. And yet, for all the blood spilled, something deeper echoed beneath it. Not chaos, but precision. Cumberland's genius had been proven, the timing exact, the roots perfect, the strikes swift. Word had not spread until it was too late. Marcus stumbled through the smoke and the screams, caught between horror and awe. He saw men he had known since childhood lift weapons with trembling hands, their faces alight with something terrible, freedom or madness, or both. He saw women cradle infants while blood smeared their dresses, their eyes fierce as they watched oppressors fall. And above it all, he saw Cumberland. Tall, gaunt, eyes burning, his voice rising like thunder as he declared, "The angel of death has passed through this land, and his work is righteous." The ground itself seemed to shudder beneath the weight of it. Marcus understood then. This was no longer a plan. It was no longer whispers or prophecy. It was reality, soaked into the soil, carved into the walls, etched into memory. The rebellion was here. And whether it ended in deliverance or destruction, none who lived through this night would ever be the same again. By the second dawn, the rebellion's fire met its first wall of iron. Word had spread at last. A rider, pale with terror, had reached Raleigh before sunrise, and within hours the county was alive with the sound of hoofbeats. Militia drums rolled like thunder across the hills. The white South, so often divided by pride and rivalries, found unity in vengeance. They came armed with muskets, sabers, pistols, but more than that, they came armed with fear sharpened into cruelty. to them, it was not 17 masters dead. It was the nightmare of Haiti reborn on Virginian soil, the collapse of order, the unraveling of everything they clung to as power, and they would make an example that would echo for generations. They swept through fields and cabins, sparing no distinction. Men cut down in doorways, women dragged screaming into yards, children's cries drowned beneath musket fire. It was not justice, nor war. It was erasure. Marcus watched from the shadows as the militia descended on Cedar Grove. The house that had burned with rebellion now burned with retribution. He saw one of the conspirators, a boy barely 16, forced to his knees before the soldiers. They demanded names. He spat blood and said nothing. The musket cracked and his body fell limp into the dirt. 17 masters had died in one night. By sundown, 3 times that number of slaves lay dead, guilty and innocent alike. The rebellion had lit a flame. The militias now smothered it in blood. But as Marcus stood trembling, he knew something had already changed. Fear had not killed the fire. It had only buried it deeper, and buried fire waits. The rebellion did not end in triumph. It ended in silence. By the 3rd day, the militias had swept the countryside clean. Cumberland's followers were hunted through swamps and pine woods, their bodies left hanging as warnings. The crosses they had carved were torn down, the blood scrubbed from thresholds, the very mention of their names forbidden. Plantation ledgers recorded them as disposed of. The courts sealed away the few confessions wrested under torture, and soon in the telling of polite society, the whole affair was reduced to rumor. A disturbance, a dark episode best forgotten. But forgetting is never whole. Marcus survived. No one ever learned why. Perhaps Hartwell's shadow stretched farther than Marcus knew. Perhaps fate spared him to carry the memory. He labored still, his body bent, his voice quiet. But his silence was no longer born of fear. It was the silence of a man who had witnessed revelation and reckoning, and who knew that even if the fire was buried, it smoldered still. Hartwell, too, bore his burden. He treated wounds, delivered children, stood at funerals, and behind his eyes he carried the knowledge that he had seen both judgment and vengeance, and that he had chosen neither. History would never speak his name, nor Marcus's, nor Cumberland's. That was by design. And yet, here you sit, reading these words. The story you have been told is not one you will find in school books, nor in archives. It lives in fragments, in whispers, in the tremor of the soil where blood once soaked. It lives because silence, however enforced, cannot erase truth forever. 17 masters died on a night when the oppressed rose against the impossible. 17 crosses stood as testament, if only for a breath of time, that fear could become fire. And though the rebellion was crushed, though memory was smothered, its echo remains. History is not what was written. History is what survives, and now you are a witness.